It's my pleasure to introduce Mike Petouhoff. He founded and he's president of One Grid Energy Solutions, and he has more than 35 years experience as the global clean energy leader focused on renewable energy transition, grid reliability, and hydrogen. He's built a reputation as someone who can bring teams together to create plans for meaningful change and then take a hands-on approach to define realistic implementation approaches to achieving those goals. Mike's experience in hydrogen includes hydrogen production, storage, and distribution, and use for reliability, transportation, buildings, and industrial use. Mike worked for many years with Apple at the corporate office. He was the Apple Global Energy team leader. He was the architect and chief implementer of the company's transition to 100% clean energy in the United States and other countries. Mike extended the zero net energy approach that he had developed to support high density manufacturing and data center loads, including not just energy efficiency and on-site renewables, but also to include various models for grid feeding and purchase clean energy. Mike also led the design of the energy system for Apple's new headquarters, a 100% renewable energy microgrid. And then also I'll just add, at the California Energy Commission, Mike led the team that developed a 5-year research and to create a more nimble grid to maintain reliability as California transitions to 100% clean energy, addressing short and long duration energy storage, hydrogen, cybersecurity, power quality, and grid congestion that will be applicable nationwide. At the Energy Commission, he also led research for natural gas system decarbonization and a hydrogen roadmap for a decarbonized California. So his bio goes on, but I think where we are right now, Mike, we'll turn it over to you to begin the program. And look forward to hearing your comments today.
Well, thank you, George, for that very kind introduction. I think I just shared my screen, and you should be able to see a PowerPoint slide. Is that up there?
Yes.
You can. You might be able to go, present and get it to go full screen if you want, but we're okay like this if needed. There you go.
Gotcha. It's on there. All right. Thank you.
Not quite. There you go. Click right there.
There we go. Okay.
Perfect.
Well, George, thank you for that kind introduction. It sounds like we have sort of a mixed audience, some energy professionals, some water professionals, some people that may be in more than one field. And so I'll try to address multiple interests as we go through this. What we thought we would do for the agenda today is really three things. First, looking, as George mentioned, I spent some time as the global energy team leader at Apple, looking to see what we can learn about one company's journey to 100% clean energy, and what can we learn from the regulatory and other types of obstacles of getting to 100% clean energy. But then actually one of the things I did at Apple was I got invited to speak to the California Energy Commission as the state of California was considering the statewide move to 100% clean energy, which introduces some new issues collectively as we take the whole grid to 100% clean energy. Questions of grid reliability really come up. So let's look at the collective impacts for grid reliability as California has made its decision to go to 100% clean energy by 2045. So that's the second topic. And then third, I want to focus in on one aspect of the grid of the future and the green economy, which is green hydrogen. It's one of the areas that's probably least well understood, so I thought that was worth focusing in on. So based on what George described, I thought those would be good topics to talk about, and then we can have some Q&A. I'm understanding you guys tried to wrap your meetings by 10. I'll try to probably present here for about a little less than an hour, and then leave some time for discussion at the end. And there may be some questions that come along during as well. So if that sounds good, I'll go ahead and jump in.
Good.
So for the first topic, what can we learn from Apple's journey to 100% clean energy? So first of all, let me say, you may be surprised that some of my discussion will be somewhat forthright, and given that Apple has a reputation for being somewhat secretive. Let me just share here. This is a full-page article that Tim Cook took out in the New York Times. It was in the context of Apple and Samsung talking about swiping each other's, swiping Apple's ideas being swiped. Here, Apple took a public stand to say, we want companies to copy some of these ideas. So even though Apple was known to be very secretive, Apple really wanted to show leadership in this particular area. And I will say that what we did was fairly influential. And part of our intention wasn't just to green Apple and meet our objectives, but to do things that would be accessible and doable industry-wide that could be industry shaping. This is a graph. Actually, somebody from the Department of Energy pointed this graph out that showed in North Carolina, the first place where we did major renewable energy. Once we sort of broke the code and figured out how to make it work technically and financially, it sort of, as some people described it, Duke Energy, it opened the floodgates and caused a real flood of projects in that area. And we really intended to green Apple and also set an approach that could be followed by others. But there are certainly some challenges. And I'll share some of the approaches, some of the challenges from a regulatory perspective about that. And I think one of the take-home messages is, and this effort was in the US and many other countries overseas, the United States is really a hodgepodge of 50 different regulatory environments in each state. And states like North Carolina are more similar to China, and states like California are more similar to the European Union. But it's really a hodgepodge, but there is sort of a method to the madness, and you can kind of create a playbook to move through all these different aspects. So let me just jump into that. First, let me say that we, shortly after I started at Apple, I was wondering, why do they want an energy guy at Apple? Because every zoo has to have a zebra, so every company has to have an energy guy. One thing I learned was that Greenpeace was very much on Apple's tail. And this thing on the left here is actually some kind of a pod that Greenpeace created and placed in front of the main headquarters building at the time at One Infinite Loop. So that's actually the local sheriff looking in the window, and there's actually people inside of this pod. They have sort of a Mr. Microphone where they can make announcements, and a projector where they projected images on Apple's buildings. And their message was, and in their first report, they said, hey, Apple is a leader in technology, but they're really not showing leadership in the environment, in clean energy. And there was some truth to that. And so part of my job was to pull this forward. Luckily, we actually had put together a strategy before this happened, and we were in the process of unrolling it. And so we just quietly went ahead and did our plan. But I will say that Greenpeace had some pretty strong feedback for us, and I'll show you at the end how their feedback shifted over time. But their comment when they first started wasn't that Apple wasn't doing well. It's that Apple was the last in the tech industry, was at least Greenpeace's judgment. So that's sort of our starting point. So let me talk just briefly about what our strategy was. And again, we had laid this out before Greenpeace had their comments, but it was just really in the process of implementing it. So we really have three tiers. So the first is the ideal thing to do in energy is to first reduce the load through energy efficiency, and then meet that reduced load through a combination of either, let's say, company-created projects or grid-purchased energy. This diagram actually we developed at Chevron Energy Solutions when we did West Village, which is California's first zero net energy town, and it really just had the energy efficiency and the on-site projects. That village, which is not a paper study, it's a place where people live right now, is 100% clean energy from within the footprint of the site. For super intense loads, we'll look at some of those. Sometimes there needs to be other models as well. But these are the three tiers. Essentially reduce the load through efficiency and then meet it through various forms of renewables. We really adopted three principles also: displacement, additionality, and accountability. Displacement meaning we really want to show that the renewable energy we're creating displaces fossil source generation in the same grid region that we're operating in. Additionality is something that we want to show through our actions. Something is happening that would not have otherwise happened on the grid. We're just not taking credit for something that was already there. And then accountability is various ways of measuring this, making sure we don't double count. Typically, what we did is we said, let's use the same measurement and accountability protocols that utilities have to use to demonstrate their compliance with state rules. We would just adopt that as a corporation. So those are our three principles. And then we had three spheres. We started off with our corporate data centers, then moved to our retail stores, and then eventually suppliers. Many people may be aware of the new SEC requirements for Scope 3 reporting. Your suppliers are not you, but they're part of your footprint in the Scope 3. And there's a lot of debate over Scope 3 reporting, which is quite nuanced. Early before I joined Apple, there was quite a bit of discussion that in any manufacturing company, much of your footprint is actually from your suppliers. So we should focus on the product and the suppliers and not our own. And the insight that came to me was one day when I was doing an Earth Day event in our local park, my wife said, "Mike, how does our backyard look? As opposed to how's it doing with cleaning up the local park?" And it reminded me that you need to take care of your home front first. And so really the philosophy we adopted was, let's take care of Apple's own load with our corporate data centers and then retails, and then use that as a way to demonstrate what our suppliers should do. And I'll kind of share some of the ways we unfolded that strategy. So one of the first places we looked was made in North Carolina. So in North Carolina was our first data center. And some of the criticism in the past, when it was just corporate offices, wasn't that worrisome. But this data center is where Siri lives, and iTunes, and other things that are closely associated with the brand. So when those are associated with being powered by coal, that's a greater concern. If we had taken the standard approach, which would be to put, let's say, solar panels on the roof of this building, the energy intensity of this building is so intense that would have only met 3 or 4% of the load. This building is a 13-acre data center, and the energy per square foot consumption would dwarf what you'd take to do solar panels. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but up in the corner here, you can see a 100-acre solar farm. So we took a strategy here of using a law called PURPA, which allows a renewable energy qualifying facility to present to the grid, to the local utility, and the local utility has to take that power at a specific type of avoided rate. And so we built a 100-acre solar farm, had it feed into the same substation that was feeding our data center, and worked out a long-term arrangement with Duke Energy that they would buy our clean energy even as they supplied the load for the data center. And our protocol was to say that at the end of any given year, we would true up to be 100% clean energy. So that's really the strategy we took. This up here is PV1. I'll show you some other ones. We actually, as we expanded the data center capacity, we just built new roughly 100-acre of solar arrays and also hydrogen fuel cells powered by biogas to be able to keep up with our load. So we were able to match our growth and our load with renewables in the same footprint that fed our data center. And we felt that was really a demonstration of additionality. Clearly, through our efforts, we did this. We built these solar farms ourselves through an engineer, procure, construct type of a contract, if you're familiar with that contract mechanism. So we were actually the owner, put out the capital, and gather the revenue from this energy feeding into the grid. So that was one sort of model in the playbook under a law called PURPA that we used to do this. And it was, I think, pretty well received in terms of additionality. We had an accountability mechanism to measure the output and match it against the use of the data center. So one of our next, and again, this effort was in the United States and in 32 other countries. So I'm just going to do a representative sampling, not all the different ones. But another place we decided to set up a data center was in Reno, Nevada. And the guidance I got from the headquarters was, hey, can you do that same thing you did in North Carolina? And the answer is no. Although PURPA is a federal law, each state gets to put their own implementation strategy together. In Nevada, as you may know, there's years of litigation between the casinos and NV Energy, the utility there. And the PURPA implementation that state had developed was to say, well, we can have a reverse auction, and some people can do these PURPA qualifying facilities when we have a reverse auction. And the last one was scheduled about 15 years ago, and there's not one scheduled in the future. So there was theoretically a mechanism, but not really. And given the history of litigious environment in Nevada, we thought the only way we can really make this happen is if we actually hold hands with the utility and jointly go to the utility commission and propose something together. So Apple and NV Energy said, okay, what we're going to do is create a solar farm in the desert right next to NV Energy's existing power plant on NV Energy's property. And we're going to design it, build it, and operate it, and then flip ownership over to NV Energy so it can be part of their generating fleet. So we're creating additionality, but we're letting NV Energy be in the utility business, the green energy business for the long term. It was a very groundbreaking approach. Many commissioners, when we took it to the utility commission, said, hey, we haven't seen an end user work this cooperatively with NV Energy before, and they applauded it. It was unanimously approved. So, and you'll notice these solar panels are a little bit different because it's the high desert. There's something called high direct normal irradiation. You can trace the rays, if you think of your high school physics, through this parabolic reflectors. And essentially you have a large reflector and a small solar panel where the light is being reflected, because the silicon is more expensive than the aluminum of the reflector. So this is a type of technology that worked in the high desert in a financial and regulatory arrangement that was somewhat unique at the time. This is actually the natural gas power plant in the desert. This is our solar array. You can see the cooling ponds next to the natural power plant. And we really did have additionality in the placement. We created something new in the desert. As the sun came up and this power plant increased energy, the natural gas combined cycle plant would cycle down. So there was really direct displacement of fossil fuel energy in this power plant that powered the state capitol in Carson City area. So that was another model where we couldn't use PURPA. We used a different approach. If you remember a few years back, both Arizona and Nevada were actually repealing their solar programs and incentives, but our leadership had decided to do a fairly major facility in Arizona. So we worked with the local utility there and built an even larger solar plant in cooperation with Salt River Project, which was the utility project there, which is a utility that was collectively put together by essentially agricultural interests and farmers to meet their energy needs. They happen to be our serving utility. And we worked through a method where we would build the solar farm, take the energy, much like in Nevada, and meet our energy needs of our facility through this plant that we had created ourselves. So that's kind of what it looked like in Arizona. We also have operations in China, and as many know, a lot of Apple's manufacturing is in China. So we took an undertaking there, and I will say that even though this is a different country, we were able to work with China's 5-year plan, and the protocol here actually looks more like North Carolina than anything else. We essentially built a solar farm, sell the energy into the grid through state grid on behalf of our load. And here in China, it's quite similar, although the value of the actual energy has a certain economic value based on the commodity rate of energy, and the Ministry of Finance pays a premium for the fact that it's solar. So it's a little bit different arrangement, but quite similar in what's called a feed-in tariff that we did in North Carolina in our approach to in China. Now, if anyone, let me, I think we can use some of the emojis and responses on here. Let me know, has anyone done a solar project and encountered any environmental resistance? I don't know if anyone's done that or identify that, but certainly we see endangered species, wetlands, those kind of things impacting solar projects. Certainly in China, we were up on the Sichuan Plateau, and the local yaks were quite important. So we used a similar technology that we'd used in Nevada with tracking panels that were up above the ground, so we could continue grazing in agricultural operations for the grasslands below the panels. And China's Ministry of Interior did a study and showed that the grass actually grew better with our solar panels than without it. And so it was able to support the indigenous population who depended on the yaks for their sustenance. And the yaks sustenance was able to be compatible with our solar use. And so we had to go through a process not different from the US environmental impact review kind of process in China as we did this. So again, similar to what we saw in North Carolina. Let me talk a little bit about Apple's own campus. George mentioned I led the energy track working with a company called ARUP, which was the overall engineer for the project. And Apple's campus is a 100% dispatchable microgrid that's 100% renewable energy. And the architecture here combined all the elements of our strategy, really the efficiency, Apple created projects in grid purchased energy. If you look at this chart, you can see the light green. By the way, the summer chart is the summer, and the winter lower chart is the winter. The light green is the amount of energy you're going to use year round. We took a February weekend day and guessed or estimated the amount of energy use and said, we're going to have fuel cells generating steady baseload energy year round to meet that sort of load. We're going to have this dark green being the solar, 14 megawatts of on-site solar to meet the load as it peaks during the summer, and its production peaks during the summer. And then the blue is some residual grid feeding power that I'll talk about in a moment to balance it. But most of the power was met on site, and we made the generation profile match the consumption profile. And this was important because the rules in California don't allow you to run your meter backwards at more than a megawatt. So we had two 10 megawatt meters, and we had to make our production somewhat closely match our consumption, so we wouldn't be running the meter backwards too much. So it was a sort of born out of necessity, but it begins to address this issue of grid reliability, not just how many kilowatt hours are we putting into the grid, but how does it match the overall consumption, and how does that impact the grid's reliability in terms of matching consumption and load. So we really took a strong step in that direction to do this. And let me talk a little bit about how the blue here, which is the grid feeding energy that we used to make up the balance that wasn't done on site. And again, we wanted to have additionality. So we actually partnered with a project called California Flats with the Hearst Corporation, and we used a provision in California called direct access. This is different than North Carolina, where we used PURPA. In California, there's some pretty advanced regulations that allow an end user to essentially step in the shoes of the utility and to say to the utility, we'll pay you transmission and distribution fees for use of your wires, but we are going to take your place in terms of creating generation, and we're not going to pay you for that. We're going to do that ourselves. And in our case, we're going to create our own clean generation. Slightly different model than in North Carolina, because California rules were allowed this. So we essentially did a 130 megawatt solar farm in Central California for the energy being arranged to be delivered using the exact same protocols that utility companies use, using what's called an energy service provider to deliver that energy to Apple Park, our new headquarters campus, and other California facilities. And it was a two-phase project, and we actually over time took over more and more of the project till we get to 280 megawatt to feed future energy growth over time. So we actually started with 130 megawatts and PG&E taking the rest. And then as PG&E finished the first part, we stepped into their shoes. So really this was a utility type project that we're helping to create, and then do the same thing the utility does in terms of delivering energy to match load onto the grid. So this is a different regulatory model used for our Apple's new campus, as well as other facilities in California. So that's a different regulatory model. Now in Singapore, we had sort of a hybrid. We had something similar to direct access, which we could say no thank you to Singapore Power to their default generation grid, but we do not have 100 acres of solar farm or to put a solar farm. If you're familiar with Singapore, it's a very dense environment, dense urban environment. It is a city, it is a country, and it's an island all in one place, and very urban, and there's really not 100-acre swaths to put solar farms. So we did kind of an innovative arrangement where we worked with a third-party developer who put solar panels on the roofs of other people's buildings. And these other building owners were responsible just for the common area electrical use in their buildings, which is a pretty small proportion. So even though these are large buildings, the solar panels generated more than enough energy to meet their common area loads, and we fed the remaining energy into the grid and purchased it on their behalf. So in that realm, we replaced the fossil sourced power, typical baseload power in Singapore, with our own created renewable power on the roofs of other buildings, since we have a dense urban environment with not lots of open fields. I remember taking this to our CFO to sign it. We, without additional capital outlay, actually reduced our energy bill, because in Singapore, most of the power is generated from fossil fuels that are imported off the island, since there's no indigenous source of natural gas on the island. So we were able to actually beat grid pricing and go to 100% of clean energy strategy through sort of an interesting, nuanced approach. So I'll just share that in more than 32 countries and in most of the 50 states of the US, we took different regulatory approaches and strategies to meet our goal of 100% clean energy. This is actually Greenpeace's report from, I believe this is 2015. This is their document, not mine, but it kind of showed where they viewed Apple at this point in the process. They kind of put Apple at the front of the pack based on our principles of additionality, displacement, and accountability, and how we demonstrated those in this process. And this is actually their own report, Clicking Clean. So we took some pride in having moved from Greenpeace putting something on our campus to sort of shed a light on our use of coal in the early days, to really they're saying that they calculated our clean energy index or renewable percentage at 100% for our facility. So that was kind of a nice bit of symmetry to be able to come through and get some positive feedback from Greenpeace and others. So I'll say that as we move to the next topic, I gave a version of this presentation to the California Energy Commission. So David Hochschild, who's the current chair, was one of the commissioners. He was arguing that California should go to 100% clean energy, and there was a lot of debate whether that was a good idea or not. So Apple was invited to brief the full commission, and I gave that briefing, similar presentation to I gave today with a little bit more detail about how we approached that and the efforts we took. Given that and many other inputs, California did make the decision to go to 100% clean energy by 2045. Now that introduces a whole new set of challenges about collective impacts to grid reliability. One might argue that if one company does it or a few companies do it, they're still relying on the overall grid and the natural gas generation that provides reliability. Maybe they're cherry picking, one might say. But if everyone does it, now we have to figure out how to make the grid operate and stay reliable as we move to new sources of energy. So let's look at what that looks like. So these are some factors that affect the grid of the future. So we have intermittent wind and solar become the dominant generation sources. They're not just a little bit on top of the natural gas. If we're going to 100%, they become the dominant generation sources, followed by hydro, which is zero carbon, but not necessarily as modulatable. The important thing is here with fossil generation, we have a throttle. With wind and solar, we can't control when the wind blows or when the sun shines. So that's a whole new challenge in terms of grid reliability. I think as one of our guests mentioned, we're also talking about electrifying transportation, going with electric vehicles or maybe fuel cell vehicles. We'll talk about that. And new building code is focused on electrifying buildings rather than natural gas. Those are new loads that are going to be added to the electric grid and new use profiles, different time of occurrence of the load. So that's a new factor that needs to be considered. So the same grid has to support some degree of charging. Maybe it's supporting fuel cell vehicles with hydrogen. We'll talk about how that works. And then new construction, new buildings are going to be electric and not have natural gas. So those are all different loads. Even as we're doing all this to prevent climate change, we see that climate volatility is increasing. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better. That creates a couple of different issues. One, we've seen certainly an increase in wildfires. That may take certain parts of the grid down, may make certain transmission lines or generation not usable, which is a reliability issue. We also know that natural gas generation has what's called a derating factor. So on super hot days, when the grid is using more energy, mostly because of air conditioning, the natural gas plants actually can't go to their full capacity because they can't operate as well in heat. They can't reject the heat as well. So natural gas plants actually have less capacity on the hottest days when we need it most. And certainly we're going to, on the hottest days, we have more air conditioning and other kind of loads. So climate volatility is going to cause variations in loads beyond what we've seen in the past. So while we might predict our past, or might predict our future loads based on what's happened in the past, we have a whole new future because climate change changes load patterns. So in water resource management, sometimes we talk about 100-year floods or 10-year floods. How likely is it that you'll have an event that's a 1 in 100 type of event? We have to look at 1 in 10 or 1 in 100-year load events or climate events, and the data set may be different because we're talking about a climate volatility in the future that was not there when the past data sets were there in the past. So these are 3 of the factors that impact grid reliability that we need to deal with in solving this engineering problem. And there's something called the Garamendi principles, which stems from AB 2630. And the idea here is that as we're dealing with new load on the grid, we need to figure out how we can do that as much as possible within existing right-of-ways. It takes many years to permit a new power transmission or distribution right-of-way. So to the extent possible, we want to use existing right-of-ways, both for speed, for minimum environmental impact and for complying with the Garamendi principles. So this is sort of a problem statement. Years ago, when I did my undergraduate in engineering, I remember I had a class where I'd always get credit. We get credit for setting up the problem and defining the problem statement. And in many classes, I was very glad for those extra points for defining the problem. But I'll say years later, up the road, I found that defining the problem is one of the best first steps. And I think really articulating what are the issues we're dealing with is important. And I think this is a kind of a problem statement of some of the things that the grid faces. So given those factors impacting the grid, let's look at what the grid looks like now, and then what we think it's going to evolve to. And I think George mentioned one of the research plans we wrote. I came to the commission to help lead a team to write what turned out to be a plan for a more nimble grid to maintain reliability as we move to 100% clean energy. So let's talk about what some of that looks like. So certainly the grid of 1.0, which Edison and Tesla would probably recognize what our grid looks like today. It's not much different than it was envisioned back in those days. The grid 1.0, the previous grid is fossil generation dominant, whereas the new more nimble 2.0 is going to be intermittent wind and solar dominant. The challenge is, of course, we don't control when the wind blows or when the sun shines. In grid 1.0, generation is throttled to match the load, which is taken as a given. There are folks that watch the load and dispatch power generation to our system operator, CAISO, so that at every moment in time, at every place on the grid, the generation and the load are matching. Quite a complex effort. What we see happening in the future is generation and loads interacting flexibly. So there may be solar panels on the roof that are generation that's distributed, that's interacting with the load, and they may interact flexibly with what's happening with the centralized generation. We're also looking at increased efficiency, which has the benefit of creating excess capacity on the grid, so the grid has more freeboard or more capacity to handle shock events. So that's a super important benefit. And the question came up: what happens if we create more generation than we need for electric cars? The good news is we'll have a little bit more capacity, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in a bit. So it's really the one-way flow of power on the grid now. We dispatch more generation with whatever happens as the load changes. Here we've got in the future more distributed two-way flow of power and data going back and forth. It's a little bit different look. I'll say in grid 1.0, the electric grid and the transportation are separate. I don't want to date myself, but my first job out of college after I graduated from the Naval Academy was I was an energy efficiency officer at a military base in South Texas. And President Carter, again, I don't want to date myself, really asked us to take this initiative because of something called the Arab oil embargo. At the time, I thought to myself, I'm happy to do this job and I'm glad we're saving energy and that's good for the environment. But what does saving lighting in buildings have to do with transportation? At the time, there wasn't much connection between petroleum for transportation and the electric grid. What we'll see now is the electric grid and transportation intertwine, both through battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles. So we'll look at that as those being much more commingled as we move forward, that transportation and electric grid are going to be more intertwined. So let's talk about power flow control. This is one of my favorite topics. So really, power flow control is about the when, the where, and the how much of power. So again, in the old school thought, we would just dispatch power to meet new load. The thought here is that we would use short and long duration storage to store power and dispatch it when we need it, even if it wasn't when the wind was blowing or the sun is shining. There's also other power flows that happen that could be unexpected in terms of location. And there's something called impedance control that allows us to route power over one a line versus another if one is getting close to being maximized on its capacity. So this is not something that we've done a lot of in the past, but we have the ability to do that to reroute power. And then lastly, in the how much or the amount of energy flow control, mindful of the Garamendi principles, there's something called smart reconductoring. So there's conductors that will have at least as much as double the ampacity of our existing transmission and distribution lines with the same weight. So without creating new pylons and towers, we can reconductor and have up to double the capacity we have now on the exact same right-of-ways. We could even go further if we want to replace towers and pylons, but even without replacing them, we can as much as double the capacity. So this gives you, imagine, a much more nimble environment, controlling the when, the where, and how much of power flow control. And this was part of the research initiative that our team defined under EPIC. And let me just mention, so the California Energy Commission has a program called EPIC, Electric Program Investment Charge. And all of you who've paid into it, whether it be for your personal residential bill or your commercial bill, there's a little bitty charge that everyone pays into every month. And this goes into a fund that turns out to be over 15 years, about $1.5 billion. So every 5 years, there's roughly a $500 million research planning effort. And so our team put together the more nimble grid component of this. And this is some of that research that was defined and approved last December by the California Public Utility Commission. Also, resource diversity of storage is needed. So we've seen the geopolitical issues that result as we have challenges throughout the world in petroleum, right? There's geopolitical issues of who controls the petroleum, and it's not always our friends that control it. We want to make sure the same things don't happen with lithium ion, which is the predominant methods of storage. So some research is looking at alternative forms of storage, such as iron air batteries, both plentiful substances, iron and air, where you essentially can create storage using iron and air, or battery technologies that are essentially large blocks of silicon, which get heated by electricity, and then the energy is absorbed from those heated panels by something similar to solar panels that are absorbing the infrared energy coming off those silicon blocks. So again, more plentiful substances, carbon, silicon, iron, air, that don't necessarily need lithium ion, that could help provide the grid need, even as lithium ion is the predominant mechanism in transportation batteries, and has been on the grid as well. So resource diversity is something that's needed. And hydrogen is a big important part of that, as I'm going to call it a storage vector. One thing good about hydrogen is, unlike a battery that needs to be charged, we don't have that additional constraint on the grid about not just using the battery, but deciding when to charge it, which draws from the grid, and then we need to discharge it, which adds to the grid. The hydrogen can be somewhat independent, more independent than battery. So it's a vector, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. This is for any electrical engineers in the crowd. One thing we'll lose as we lose our generation fleet is that rotational inertia keeps the generation in sync. So we'll need new forms of power quality control in what we'll call an inverter-centric grid, where the inverters from wind farms and solar farms are what's providing the power. They don't have the same natural mechanism to keep each other in sync as rotational generation does in a combined cycle generation kind of plant. And then lastly, increase cybersecurity issues. So there's a lot more modulation going on in this more nimble grid, and a lot more points of control, and a lot more vulnerability to cybersecurity. So that's always been a concern, but a greater concern in the more nimble grid of the future. So I would share with you that that's kind of what it looks like as the grid evolves to the future, to be more nimble to meet these various challenges. So given this, I'll also say there's lots of trade-offs. So one of them is there's an SB 100 report, which is a joint agency report done by California Energy Commission, California Public Utility Commission, and CAISO. And it's done really to talk about implementing SB 100, which is California's legislation that talks about how to get to 100% clean energy. Let me say that SB 100 requires California to go to 100% clean energy, but does not require us to eliminate combustion necessarily. So in the SB 100 report, they define roughly 15 gigawatts of something called zero carbon firm dispatchable resources. Sometimes different terms are used, but essentially this could be an existing natural gas power plant refueled with either hydrogen or biogas. There's concerns that we don't have enough biogas to just convert all the generation, but this is only a subset of it. And this could be a converted power plant. But there's a lot of concerns and public debate about air emissions, especially NOx. Now, in these plants, excuse me, there's no nitrogen in the feedstock because they're hydrogen or biogas, which is methane. But it's the very fact that there's high temperature combustion ongoing with the nitrogen that naturally is part of air that creates NOx. So the fact that we have combustion occurring in air creates NOx, even though there's no nitrogen in the hydrogen feedstock. So one option is to have this kind of converted power plants, concern being NOx, or another option to say, no, we're not going to have any combustion at all. This is called the aspirational approach, not required by SB 100, and it's been determined in the SB 100 report to cost an additional $8 billion to ratepayers per year, not trivial. And the amount of solar build out, if we don't do this, is about double. So we've seen in the previous slides, and many have experienced, we saw what it takes to accommodate yaks, wetlands, other types of environmental constraints as we do solar projects. Let's assume we've been logical and took the easiest sites first in our solar project siting. That means that the ones remaining are going to be more difficult. So there's land use and other environmental impacts that are not trivial as we build out the solar to make this happen. So this really, if you think about it, looks like a dilemma. Do we accept some NOx emissions, or do we take this more expensive approach? One thing I think is interesting to look at is this chart, which shows, and we stopped and looked at the big picture, and I think this is where looking at transportation and the grid together is important. All of our current electric generation only emits less than 1% of the statewide NOx. Most of the NOx comes from mobile sources. And we're talking only a portion of our power plants being converted to complement wind and solar, so that it's a portion of that 1%. So the conclusion is here, the largest NOx reduction opportunity is actually a grid that supports zero emission transportation. So whether it be fuel cell vehicles or electric vehicles, the biggest NOx reduction is going to come from a transportation grid that's robust, because we've already cleaned up our power plants pretty significantly. And so this kind of puts that in perspective. It's not zero impact, but it kind of puts it in perspective. One concern as well is that power generation plants are mostly are concerned that they could be located in disadvantaged communities. We actually map them out, less than half of them are, and we have the opportunity to figure out which plants for conversion might be least impactful to local communities. So this helps us to be able to look at the trade-offs and balance what those look like. And this shows the viability of hydrogen as a pathway, one of the components for grid reliability. So given that, let's move to topic 3. Now that we've talked about grid reliability and the role of hydrogen, let's focus in on hydrogen, which is one of the areas that's least well understood. So let me talk just the basics of hydrogen. So if you remember from your high school chemistry, hydrogen's in the upper left corner. It's the lightest molecule in the periodic table. As a gas, it has 1/3 the energy per unit of methane, which is what natural gas is made out of, but 3 times the energy of CH4 on a weight basis. This is important as we look at some different replacement opportunities, less energy per volume, but more energy per weight, because it's so little dense. If you remember Avogadro's principle, in a certain volume of gas, there's the same number of molecules at a standard temperature and pressure. Since hydrogen is a small molecule, its gas density at any given temperature and pressure is much lower than other gases. So that's important. We'll see some of that coming up in a bit. So let's talk about definitions. Most of the hydrogen in the world today is used in petroleum manufacturing. It's gray hydrogen, which is produced from reforming fossil fuel feedstocks. And gray hydrogen accounts for about 95% of global hydrogen production today. So it's reformed from typically methane. Basically, steam knocks some of those CH4 molecules off and allows them to become H2 and CO2. And so that's gray hydrogen, which is the predominant source. Some of the equipment overlaps, some of it doesn't with green hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is a term being used to talk about fossil fuel feedstocks which have carbon capture at the point of production. Now, that is an option, and many, especially in the petroleum industry that want to continue current operations, find that attractive, because if they can do carbon capture, then that helps. The challenge is, if it has to be at the point of production, there's something called the Langmuir isotherm that makes it easier to get to 85% carbon capture. If you get to 90, 95%, 100%, it gets harder and harder to get to those last percentage if you want to get to those last percentages. And then green hydrogen, which is mainly what we're talking about here. There's multiple pathways, but mainly it's electrolytic hydrogen, which is converting green energy, electricity from, let's say, wind or solar, through something called an electrolyzer to green hydrogen. Other forms of green hydrogen could be reforming, like we do with the refineries, but reforming biogas, which is a carbon neutral source, to create green hydrogen. So these are different color schemes that have been used. This is a much debated topic. There's other ways of going about grading these, and there's thoughts about new schemes, but you can see the tracking mechanism for where the origin of the hydrogen is going to become important. If there's different implications for green hydrogen, blue and gray, it'll be important to be able to document where it came from. So given that, let's talk about the California Energy Commission's Hydrogen Roadmap, which is a project that I had the privilege to lead. And let me tell you, I went to graduate school and learned a bunch of good things. Being at the California Energy Commission was like going to graduate school all over again, because it was just a great experience to learn about what's happening in California and all over the world. But for the Hydrogen Roadmap, we had working groups with Denmark, Finland, Germany, Chile, to name a few, with their working groups. We did collaboration with LADWP, Northern California Power Association, SoCalGas, Department of Energy, San Diego Gas and Electric. And we did workshops with research focus on EPIC and something called IPER on the policy aspects of this. We did lots of public outreach and coordination. The process looks at H2 production, which could be electrolysis with electrolyzers, which could be alkaline, which is the predominant method, proton exchange membranes, which are used often in transportation, solid oxide, even photonic sources or different methods that are emerging technology that's being looked at. Because of the use of water in breaking water into hydrogen and oxygen, electrolyzing salt water from the ocean is something that's being looked at to see if that's practical and if we can harvest some of the minerals that come from that process. So that's some of the research area. On storage and delivery, there's many ways, including storage in gaseous tanks, tube trucks, pipelines, geologic storage, as we've done for natural gas. Hydrogen can also be stored in geologic storage like salt domes. And then because of the low density of hydrogen, other forms of hydrogen, including liquefying it, converting to other molecules such as green ammonia or green CH4, so that it can be used in more dense mechanisms. We'll show you some examples of that. And there's also looking at ecosystems of land-based hydrogen versus hydrogen coming from land-based PV or offshore wind. Another way of moving the onshore impact of PV is to have offshore wind, and that has its own marine type of impacts, but at least we're spreading those impacts out. And then in terms of end uses, we're looking at storage and reliability, which could be both grid and for buildings, transportation, which could be fuel cell electric vehicles, aviation, shipping, and rail, hard to heat, hard to electrify industrial applications and buildings. So that's kind of an overview of what the Hydrogen Roadmap is about. Let me just talk about two things. One is people say, well, will hydrogen become cheap enough to beat wind and solar? And I would say that's probably the wrong question. But let's talk about the hydrogen cost structure. So it has to do with the electrolyzer cost, how much we utilize the electrolyzer, and the energy input. And as it turns out, the main factor is actually the input cost of the energy. So how much is the electricity that you're using to make the green hydrogen? And what it really boils down to is hydrogen will never be cheaper than the wind or solar that it comes from. So it won't replace wind and solar. It's there to be a vector or a complement to wind and solar. And in that vein, let me talk briefly about this, this chart here. If you focus a little bit on this graph with the red and the green, let me talk about what's happening, because it matters for the grid and it matters for transportation applications also. So if you look at hydrogen, and what we really want to compare here is the duration of the storage output. So storage is classified as short duration and long duration. The take-home message here is that hydrogen is more efficient in the long duration and beats lithium ion in the long duration. In the short duration, lithium ion is most effective, and then it kind of gets more expensive as the duration increases. Hydrogen eventually levels off and becomes kind of a steady cost as duration gets increased. Now let me talk about why this is. Let me say you have a 1 megawatt hour discharge requirement. You're going to discharge 1 megawatt for 1 hour. I could take a 1 megawatt hydrogen turbine and I could discharge for 1 hour. Okay, we're good there. Or I could take a 1 megawatt hour battery and discharge for 1 hour. And we'd be good there. Let's say now I want to, whoops, go back here. Let's say I want to go to 10 hours. On the battery, I have to have 10 times as much battery to get 10 hours when I go from 1 hour to 10 hours. That's 10 times the capital cost. On the hydrogen, the same 1 megawatt turbine just runs 10 hours long instead of 1 hour. I have the variable cost of fuel, but my hydrogen turbine is the same. Point is, the hydrogen levels out with only the variable cost of fuel as the duration gets longer. Lithium ion, every time I double or triple the discharge duration, I have to double or triple the capital to get more batteries. So this basic mechanism is going to be in play under different applications, grid, transportation, but basically the message is hydrogen is going to win out in longer durations. It's not the answer for short duration. And in fact, lithium ion can do shorter durations than our current peakers. It can do microsecond type of discharge, which will be important for the grid of the future. So lithium ion kind of wins for the short term. Hydrogen wins for the long term. We'll see some other applications to that in transportation. So the take home message is stored hydrogen can be a method of storage for the grid, for buildings, for lots of different mechanisms. That's really the take home message. It's not a replacement for wind and solar. It's a complement. And we'll look at many different ecosystems, land-based PV plus H2. We've got this, we can't control when the wind blows or when the sun shines, but we can store the energy for when it's not blowing or the sun isn't shining. We also can have offshore wind. Now we know that the wind profiles actually complement solar. And there's a reason for that. As the sun goes down, the solar obviously is going to produce less, but that's what causes the difference between the land temperature and the air temperatures, which causes the late afternoon breezes. So wind picks up just as solar is dropping off. And offshore wind's even more steady. So there we want to bring that offshore wind to shore. We want to have it complement wind and solar, kind of like we did with Apple's campus. Let's balance the different forms of generation so they match the load. And then store what we can't use as hydrogen to be used in other examples. A place where this has happened is in the North Sea. In Europe, there's quite a bit of effort for hydrogen storage of wind energy that's happened there. Each of these requires different delivery and storage. So let's talk briefly about that. So hydrogen can be stored in stationary tanks, in tube tank trucks, can be dedicated pipelines or limited reuse of natural gas pipelines. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And they can also use depleted geologic structures that currently are used to store methane, fossil source natural gas. That's also an option as well. So let's talk about transportation, which I think some people were asking about earlier today. So California's executive order requires that new passenger cars and light trucks will be zero emission by 2035. And heavy duty vehicles will be 2045 with drayage trucks in operation by 2035. These can either be fuel cell electric vehicles or battery electric vehicles. The verdict's still out where that's headed. But if you look at that previous diagram about duration, what we're seeing where fuel cell vehicles have the predominance is in long haul trucks. If we try to do very long duration trucks, that battery gets so big, it begins to compete with the payload. So fuel cells, like we saw with the electric grid example, are able to go longer duration without becoming as heavy as battery electric vehicles. Verdict is still out, lots of discussion, lots of technology development. But whether the electricity is coming from the grid, from wind and solar into car chargers, or the electricity is coming from the grid to hydrogen fueling stations, really there's interaction between the grid and the transportation. So that's important. It's still to be played out how much of that's going to be hydrogen, how much that's going to be battery electric vehicles. In parallel, there's other transportation industry initiatives for shipping, for rail, and for airplane flight. One thing we're seeing is various forms of fuel, alternative fuels that have a hydrogen component, biofuels with hydrogen, other types of things that are being looked at. For example, we looked at ammonia being used as a carrier molecule. Green ammonia can be used as a marine transportation fuel with some modification. So many shipping companies are looking at that, even aviation companies are looking at that. So that could be other places where it could be a competing use for the hydrogen that could be used to stabilize the grid or for transportation. So we see a lot of interaction between the grid of the future and transportation, whether it be charging electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles. let me talk a little. This is kind of a busy slide. I didn't have a chance to simplify it, but let's talk about industrial process heat and distribution with hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas. Let me just say that there's some challenges with just simply changing out hydrogen just to replace natural gas across the board. One reason is that in the U.S. especially, blending of hydrogen is limited to about 20% by volume or 7% by weight, due to the fact that hydrogen can cause metallurgical embrittlement or crack growth in our existing natural gas pipelines. So we need to, if we're going to have a hydrogen use, we need to maybe a dedicated use with a dedicated new pipeline. This is a little bit different in Europe, where town gas or coal gas has been used, which has a hydrogen component in it, and the metallurgy of their pipelines accommodates hydrogen better than here. So one issue is pipeline safety. Going to 100% hydrogen is limited. Now, there are plastic sections of the natural gas system that are less impacted. There's potential for replacement, but it's not something we can just change out tomorrow. Also, the amount of energy carried in the pipeline is significantly reduced for hydrogen versus methane. As we saw in the periodic table, it's a much less dense gas. So you don't get as much energy being carried if you convert to 100% hydrogen. It is possible to transmit hydrogen in dedicated purpose-built pipelines. So let's say you're going to convert a power plant to 100% hydrogen. You could have it have a new pipeline that's designed for hydrogen, or co-located next to the electrolyzer, so there's not much shipment. And there's a process where you can take green H2 along with CO2 and make green methane, essentially natural gas that has a green footprint, and that can be put in the pipelines, but it's going to be much more expensive. There's other issues about how the flame looks. This is a propane flame, it's a little picture here, and the hydrogen flame, which emits in the infrared spectrum. You can't actually see it in the visible spectrums in many cases. And there's, depending on the concentration, you may need to modify burners or have a completely different system. So it's not a direct one-for-one replacement to go from natural gas to methane, but there are applications where it may make sense. So let's talk about what's actually happening out there. These are some of the large publicly announced projects. Many of were collaborators in the hydrogen roadmap. SoCal Gas, LEDWP, San Diego Gas Electric, Northern California Power Agency, that are going through quite a few, going through real project development as we go. Also, the Department of Energy has many grants through the infrastructure grant program, and there's about $8 billion for somewhere between 4 and 8 regional hubs. Many exciting projects in California. April 7th is the next submission, and there's thought that California will be one of the hubs. California Energy Commission also has $100 million of state legislative funding that is being used for hydrogen as well. So statewide, California is considered a good test bed for hydrogen and should be a good candidate for these DOE grants. There's an organization called ARCHES, which is an acronym you can see there. It's coordinating California's submission, but these are real grants. If there's worried about volatility in the economy, that's always a concern, but this is federal money that's already been approved. So that's kind of what's going on in the hydrogen realm. So in summary, I think we talked about Apple's journey and what we can learn from there in terms of the regulatory challenges. We talked about the collective impacts to grid reliability as California moves to 100% energy by 2045. And we focused in a little bit more on the green hydrogen aspect of the grid of the future and the green economy. So with that, I'd like to open it up for discussion and questions. And we have a few minutes for that. Turn it back to you, Mark and George.
I have to unmute myself. Yeah, I had one question regarding Mike, and thank you, Mike. Excellent presentation. Yeah, I hope we get a few questions here before we wrap up. But one question I have is when you're talking about replacing natural gas with hydrogen in power plants, for example. I guess the first question is the technology feasible today? Or does the technology have to be extensive research and development to create the technology? And then once you get there, is there a significant increase in the cost of the process? For example, a natural gas fired power plant that would become powered by hydrogen. would there be an increase in cost and that, which would be transferred onto to the ratepayer?
Okay, good question, George. So a couple different questions. Is the technology there? Yes, there's manufacturers that have hydrogen turbines in their pipeline for product delivery, certainly within the next 5 years. Mitsubishi is one. There's others out there. They take two forms. One is to change the combustor aspect of it, which is the main thing that needs to be changed. Others are completely new hydrogen turbines that are designed to run on hydrogen from scratch. Some areas we see, we talked about Northern California Power Association, or Power Authority. Their situation was such that they had a combined cycle natural gas plant, end of life, needed replacement. They could have either designed a new combined cycle natural gas plant. They said, let's just go with, as the replacement, let's just go with hydrogen. So those technologies are out there in development, not R&D, but commercial development with timelines in the very near future for plant replacement now, with 100% turbines or retrofits for the combustion aspect, depending on the blend mix. And there's a slide I didn't show about increasing blending, starting with different percentages, going up to 100% blend. You would need a dedicated pipeline for those kind of situations. So it's possible. Cost-wise, that's going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's not the same operation. So picture a natural gas plant was running essentially 24/7, providing base load. This is going to be running only to complement wind and solar on certain times when we don't have the wind blowing over the sun shining. So much less run hours. So just like lithium ion, it may be more expensive per kilowatt hour discharged, but we're not talking as many run hours. So the idea is wind and solar are now less expensive than fossil. We use a little bit of that cost premium for the storage to complement them.
Right. Good. Thank you. And I see Rajiv Dabir. Feel free to jump in, Rajiv. But in the chat line, Rajiv asked the question, why was energy storage not used at Apple headquarters?
Rajiv, I really appreciate your question. It was used. I just neglected to mention it just in terms of brevity. But it's a microgrid architecture. It's got a remote interactive gateway to CAISO, which makes it dispatchable as a load by CAISO. It includes fuel cells, solar as mentioned, and also a 4 megawatt hour storage battery, so a lithium ion battery. So that is part of it. And it's got a whole programming system to say, okay, power just went out. Did we have an earthquake? Is it going to be 3 weeks? Is it going to be 3 hours? What scenarios do we run? Do we expect that the solar will cycle, the sun will rise and it'll be able to charge the batteries? Is it nighttime? It goes through all that kind of thought process and can shed load. So it does have batteries as well as 5 tiers to shed load from high priority to low priority. So energy storage is used. It's in a microgrid architecture, and it's got a remote interactive gateway to CAISO, so it can be a dispatchable load. So they can dispatch that just like they can other types of storage assets. So
Good,
thank you for bringing that question up.
Yeah, we have 2 questions. Antonio Martin first, and then Gary Darling next.
Thanks for your presentation. Great presentation, by the way. My question is regarding your North Carolina PV project. Can you talk a little bit about maybe your recycling of the panels, because they're coming up to their half of their useful life, and so at some point they're going to have to be replaced or recycled. Is there a project for that within the parameters of that project?
Let me tell you, it was something we definitely considered at the beginning, and we go through at Apple, we'd go through a financial review from the finance team, which was mainly a bunch of Stanford MBAs who came from Goldman Sachs. So it was as if we were going to an investment bank to get our funding approved. And we looked at that question pretty carefully. The answer is we think the life of the panel survives the payback period, the initial panels, and the offtake agreement we had with Duke Energy. From there, we could rebuild a new system, but we could just repower it with new panels, which will be less cost than they originally started. And you could have a second life. So yes, a lot of the infrastructure can be reused, the tracking systems, the electrical collection and distribution can be reused, and we can just simply have repowering is what that's called. And so we do expect at some point in time, it'll be economic to do that. Each year, there's a little bit of degradation, roughly 0.5%. The production of the system will drop about 0.5%. By the end of 20 years, you've got a pretty significant reduction, but it's still a viable project. So at some point in time, you can repower and put new panels in, but you can reuse a lot a lot of the system for sure. So that was thought about. I can't speak to their current plans as to when that might happen, but we did think that through, and that's certainly an option. There is a company that is focused now. One of my colleagues that was at SunPower when we did that project, now he was at Amazon. Now he's starting his own company, a guy named Rob Vignier, and I can't remember the name of the company, but the company's focus is about recycling solar panels from repowered systems. So this is a new direction, and it is something that's quite viable, and it costs less to repower a solar system than it does to build one from scratch. And if it penciled to begin with, it'll pencil here because the solar panels are only getting much less expensive than when they started.
Mhm.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Gary, and then Ernie Avila.
Hey, Mike, thanks for your presentation today. Thought-provoking. You're obviously so well-versed, and I've learned a lot, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Looking at your formulation process, coming up with the green hydrogen roadmap, the collaboration in California looks like it's all, except for the Northern California Power Association, all Southern California. And so I'm wondering if you left off PG&E or they're simply not involved. That's the first question. And then the second is what your thoughts are related to the role that nuclear fusion is going to present to us in terms of decarbonizing our energy footprint.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I those were publicly announced projects. They have a certain date. I think the date was on the slide. Certainly, there's more, and I can't speak to all the different projects that are in the DOE grant pipeline, but I am certain there's probably some PG&E projects in there. I can't speak to the specifics. Those are just publicly announced projects as a certain timeline. Nuclear is an interesting issue. I would take it in 3 steps. There's current nuclear technology, which is baseload power. If you're in France, something like 70% of France's power is provided by nuclear. They're big believers in the baseload power that's carbon neutral. The challenge is the waste. Now, as we go to new technologies, maybe we find ways that aren't going to have the waste. There's the whole tokamak donut that's being worked on. They finally got an energy balance in the laboratory, and maybe that's out there. There are some other technologies that I've actually reviewed. We got a chance to review at Apple that are nuclear oriented, that also don't produce waste, that are different. So that could be an option. Right now, the challenge is that nuclear, even in its current form, once you handle all the newest safety requirements, it just simply doesn't compete with wind and solar anymore. Wind and solar used to be sort of aspirational. It's some fancy little decoration, but we know that natural gas is the mainstay. It's the cheap workhorse. No longer the case. Wind and solar have become very cost effective, and more so as the volume increases, we get down through the production curve. And so they actually outcompete nuclear. And I've been on projects in my consulting work where some folks that have nuclear power are saying, how can we turn our nuclear power buffer area into wind and solar, right? So I think that the baseload aspect is attractive, but it's really expensive. And though we have new technologies like the donut containment ring, there's no sense, that's not far enough along to know if it's cost effective. But the potential for baseload power that is not dependent on the whims of nature is really valuable. The question is really about whether that's going to be cost effective or not.
Okay, Ernie.
Great. Thank you very much. Great presentation, Mike. Very impressed by the information you provided. The question I have is, you're looking at the footprint of the variety of different facilities where you've implemented solar. They're pretty substantial. Given the knowledge, information you have on hydrogen, why didn't you go the hydrogen path? Or is the footprint in general for hydrogen substantially less or comparable to the solar arrays that you mentioned in your projects for the future?
Definitely hydrogen is less footprint. And I didn't focus on it as much, but if you saw the pictures of the first data center, there were both PV arrays and fuel cells. Now the fuel cells look smaller, but a 5 megawatt fuel cell is more power because that 5 megawatts is 24/7 than, let's say, a 20 megawatt solar array, because it's running on average about 5 hours a day. If you figure out full sun at noon and a little more of a shoulder in the morning and the evening. So we did do hydrogen fuel cells, both at Apple's campus. That was the base load power, where we figured the minimum load on a February weekend, and we said that's the size of the fuel cells, and then the solar panels are the peak. to follow that. So we did do that at Apple's campus and for data centers. And in this case, we did hydrogen fuel cells that reform biogas. So it's green hydrogen that's being used in creating green electricity. And part of that was speed of implementation. It's a fairly simple project, and density of footprint. It really is a much more dense footprint. There's certainly examples of the same fuel cells we use being used in Manhattan, which does not have room for 100-acre solar farms. And I think it was Hurricane Sandy where Manhattan was underwater. The buildings that were running had actually fuel cells on site. So there is a business continuity aspect of those, but certainly fuel cells are more dense. The economics depend on a lot of different things. Generally, solar is more cost effective, but fuel cells can still beat the grid given the right incentive structure. So when we looked at it for Apple's main campus, we said, hey, fuel cells beat the grid, but solar beats it even more. So let's get as much solar as we can fit, make the remainder with fuel cells sized by that base load, because fuel cells don't like to jump up and down in their load. So we had sort of the base minimum load be met by that, but they were part of the program, and they do have the benefit of being dense. On a California grid-wide basis, that's really the slide that we talked about. We need double, if we're going to convert plants to hydrogen or not, we're going to need double the PV if we don't. So that is or offshore wind, right? So I think that and those have a non-zero environmental impact. So hydrogen does have the benefit of being denser and less impact to endangered species, wetlands, other things that are traditional impacts of the large acreage of solar farms.
Mike, would you say then that the in terms of ratio for the same level of energy, what's the proportion of solar footprint versus a fuel cell facility footprint? Is it 30%, half, 50% of a solar array is what the fuel cell footprint would be, or substantially less than that?
Like way less than 10%.
Okay, thank you.
It's very small, and it's a 24/7. So if you say a megawatt of fuel cell and a megawatt of solar, there's a lot more energy, about 5 times the energy coming out of that megawatt of fuel cell, but it's much smaller.
Thanks, Mike. Great job.
I'm gonna jump in with a question if that's all right. I raised my hand anyway, but we don't have George to call on me. I just wanted to say at the East Bay Ocean Council, we certainly work a lot on kind of addressing policy barriers and care a lot about this kind of all of the above energy future that I think you talked about really eloquently kind of throughout your presentation. So if anyone else that's been to other EBLC events will recognize this question from my predecessor, but if you had a magic wand, if you were all powerful, is there some policy barrier standing in the way of finding that future, that kind of all of the above energy future? What would you say it was? And so what would you wave that wand and make happen?
Mark, good question. And let me caveat it with necessary caveat that I'm not speaking for the state of California or the Energy Commission or the Utility Commission and say, but watching the intensity of the debate about NOx and hydrogen, that one slide there, I mean, it's really a serious discussion and something to be taken with great respect, that our existing power plants are perceived to be largely within disadvantaged communities. Many are not, but many are near. So I think we need to do the air modeling to figure out air dispersion. Are they actually impacted or not? And let's look at the mobile sources are the big source. We can spin our wheels on 1%, right? We're going to do if all the power plants now are doing 1%, we're going to take a fraction of that to balance wind and solar. That's going to be something less than 1%, and use even better technology to reduce that. I think that's a huge public perception issue. Again, this is magic wand in hand. So I would say the old adage of the Pareto optimal, or don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We want to reduce all emissions, local emissions and global emissions, especially for disadvantaged communities. But let me say that having thought deeply about this question, for disadvantaged communities, one thing we can do is take hydrogen and other natural gas plants, which have a throttle or dispatchable, combine them with energy storage, and we can make immediate reductions in any place there's a peaker plant now. So the dirtiest plants, mostly in disadvantaged communities, are peakers. Peakers are dirty because they're old plants, and they put them on really fast to get some right now power. And if you combine that with storage, you get anywhere from a 40 to 70% reduction in local emissions. So let's do that for local communities. And the reasons why are kind of surprising. So one is there's something called spinning reserves. Right now, we pay certain generators to have their generator spinning, right? Just to be ready, because we need it right now. We can't wait 8 minutes to spin up their turbine, right? If you put a battery on there, you can say, okay, guys at the turbine, take a break. If we need a right now response, our lithium ion battery or whatever battery will take that call. Go ahead and spin up if you need to. And so we're not spinning something idle producing pollution when it's not actually generating anything for the grid. So we can replace spinning reserves with storage battery coupled with a generation plant, right? That storage battery is not going to do 10 hours, but it's going to get you through the 8-minute startup. And the dirtiest running is the start and the stop. So the start and stops are reduced. So it's surprising to hear 40 to 70% reduction. You can really do it with combining battery storage with generation, whether it be hydrogen or natural gas, and get immediate reduction for disadvantaged communities. As we convert to hydrogen to get the global benefit of climate change, we need to appreciate the local impacts as well. There is a lot of discussion about this. It's a loaded question, but if I had a magic wand, I would really just want to get all the parties together and really look at that question. I asked myself, because I got a lot of feedback about this thing. So I went to the air quality specialist and said, hey, how much, where are the NOx coming from? It's like, oh, and the power plant guys were telling me, hey, our power plants are really clean. I thought, well, you guys are just proud of your power plants. No, let's look at the numbers. The state numbers actually show the power plants have really become very clean over time. Not zero, but very clean. And I think there's real things we can do to reduce the NOx and other particulate emissions of concerns for disadvantaged communities and all the population. And mobile sources are the biggest source of NOx. So that's a big policy thing, I'd say. Hey, the offshore wind is huge, big. I don't know there's an obstacle. There's lots of effort going there, working with the Bureau of Energy Ocean Management. It's a combination state, federal area. California's got some specific state coordination. Their coordination with the feds is probably stronger than any other state in the country, because the feds have to administer the leases, and that's a good thing. I would just give that encouragement. And I would just say, here's the other thing I would say. I think the other thing I would say, long ago, I was President Clinton's appointee for base closure cleanups. So when I was a civil engineer corps officer, I did environmental cleanup for closed military bases. And President Clinton had this idea of let's have an accountable belly button that we can point to who's in charge of this cleanup, right? And I got tagged in my younger days, again, I'm dating myself, in the Clinton administration, to be a base closure environmental coordinator. And I learned so much from that process about having a comprehensive plan. As the Navy, in the case, we work with US EPA and state EPA. I think every state should have a grid reliability plan. And if I had a magic wand, I would say every state should have a plan. It should be regionally coordinated. The plan needs to address, number one, grid reliability, and number two, jobs. Is it possible that someone might resist 100% clean energy because of jobs? Yes. And so it needs to address grid reliability and jobs and cost effectiveness to ratepayer. I think if every state undertook that, that would be the magic. And the key thing would be to give governors of states, red or blue states, data on the jobs being created by the green economy. It's now job creative. It's not job destroying. So maybe different kind of jobs. So that if I had a magic wand, I would make an energy conversion plan for every state, regionally coordinated by the federal regions, right? And because here's the long story, but we had to do this thing where we did an amicus brief at Apple for the Obama's climate action plan. And we had to get together with Google, Facebook, and Apple to figure out what we would say. And what I said was, Obama was only asking, if you do the numbers, 26% clean energy was all he asked for. It's like, we already did that. So the conclusion I came to is every state that had made an intentional plan went way beyond 26%, and the grid did not melt down, right? So if states have a plan, the states that have a plan have been showing that they can do it. We need to put a little effort into planning, and the states that don't have a plan may learn from the states that do have a plan. And I think that would be a really productive thing. So that's thank you for that question. That brought up that's been a passion of mine for a while. I think we got to have plans.
Thanks for the wisdom and some magic there, I think, for us to unpack and all work on together. So I'm not seeing any questions. I think Rick is right. You need a quiver of magic wands. And so if Gary or Dan, any other kind of closing thoughts here as we're creeping up on 10?
Nothing in particular. Just really appreciate, Mark, your time, and I certainly learned a lot. I see a lot of people in our audience that I haven't seen those names before, so that's good stuff. So thank you very much on behalf of the East Bay Leadership Council and the Water Environment Task Force.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
guys.